Hello, gremlins! This week, I'm redrawing this digital drawing of a witch riding a broomstick. The original drawing was drawn when I was in 5th or 6th grade, around age 11. I used Adobe Illustrator to draw it, which until I was in high school was my go-to digital art program, although I outgrew it a few years after this image was drawn. In this image, a witch with curly green hair and a black pointed hat and robe is riding a broomstick in a pine forest. Her black cat is sitting on the broom behind her, and there is a full moon in the sky. I'm keeping the basic composition of the image the same. I don't think it's bad in the original, I just didn't have the skill to execute my idea at age 11. I don't often get to draw people in side profile. Most of the characters I draw face the viewer. The quick sketch to position the witch, her cat, and the broomstick went very smoothly. However, as I was detailing the sketch of the witch, things started to get difficult. I had so much trouble drawing the hands of this character. The hands were so much easier to draw in the original. After all, the only visible hand is just a circle. I decided to sketch just a short section of the broomstick in some of the empty space around my sketch to figure out the placement of the hand before trying to attach it to the rest of the body. After a few unsuccessful tries drawing a hand gripping a stick, I used my phone camera to take a photo of my own hand, holding my digital pen's case as though it was a broomstick. This made drawing the hand much easier. Then I realized I needed to draw the other hand. In the same section of sketch, I used another reference image of my other hand, placed just ahead of the first hand. Then I moved that sketch into position. The hand I drew first looked fine attached to an arm, but the second hand, the one in the forward position, didn't. In order to attach to the body, the arm had to be too long. I tried moving the hand backwards, behind the other, but the arm still looked wrong. I spent a long time messing with the position of the hands and arms until it finally looked okay, both arms the same length. Another struggle came up a little while later during the sketch, as I drew this witch's clothing. In the original image, the witch is wearing a black dress, or robe, or something, although I added more detail to the dress in my new rendition. I ran into a problem when drawing the skirt. How would one ride a broomstick in a skirt? When looking up reference images of people posing on broomsticks in witch costumes, most people in skirts rode side saddle, both legs over one side of the broomstick. I suppose that would work, but the character was already posed, and while I don't have any personal experience riding flying brooms, I think sitting side saddle would be rather inconvenient for flying accurately and at speed. My next idea was to look up reference images of people on bikes in skirts, but most people are smart enough to not wear long flowy skirts on a bike. I was drawing blind. I just ended up kind of hand-waving how the skirt sits over the broom. I added folds in the fabric until it didn't look too wrong and moved on. I decided to try something new with the line art in this image. Usually, I use a 7-point pressure-sensitive brush for all the line art in an image, occasionally making the brush a bit smaller when drawing jewelry or other small details. The line has a little variable weight based on the pressure I put on the pen when drawing, but not much. In this drawing, however, I experimented with changing the size of my brush as I worked, making it bigger on outlines like the hat and outer outline of the dress and side profile, then shrinking it when drawing inner details, the face and the hair. I made it even smaller for other details, like the stripes on the edges of the dress and capelet. Constantly changing the size of my brush did make the line art take longer, but I think the result is really dynamic and way more interesting than my line art usually ends up being. I might not use this method in every drawing, but I definitely want to play around with it more. Let me know what you think of it in the comments. The original image was drawn when I was going through a witchcraft phase, which started in the summer between 5th and 6th grade as far as I remember. I don't remember exactly what triggered this phase, but I know there were a few weeks where I was wearing a dressing gown and hat with a cardboard cone taped to the top, using my hairbrush as a wand and pretending to brew potions. My mom even crocheted me a proper conical witch hat with a purple band and a buckle, which I loved. During this phase, I drew a lot of witch-based art, most of it physical with a color pencil in my sketchbook, but some of it digital, like this piece. A lot of those drawings were of shelves of potion ingredients, the most common appearances being rat blood, ogre spit, poison ivy juice, eyeballs, and worms. However, when choosing what image to redraw, I chose one that included this witch character, because she was one of the earliest appearances of Hazel Quickthorn, an OC I introduced a few months ago in the video linked here. I already talked about Hazel Quickthorn on the channel, but since not many people watched that video, I'll give you a quick introduction. Hazel Quickthorn is a witch who lives in a spooky forest where all the scary magical creatures live, like werewolves, vampires, ghosts, and of course, witches. Hazel is a potion maker and seller, selling her wares at the midnight market. While I kept most elements from the original drawing in this updated version, I did add details where they originally were not. The biggest change is the robes, which were plain black and shapeless originally. I added a capelet around the shoulders and considered adding a full cape flying out behind Hazel in the wind, but decided against it since it would cover up Hazel's cat familiar. I also added some colour to her robes, with stripes around the hem of the capelet and skirt, and of the cuffs of the sleeves. These are the same shade of green as the band around her hat, since of course she matches her accessories to her clothing. I also gave Hazel Edwardian lace-up boots because I think they look really cool and witchy, and I'd love to someday own a recreation pair myself. Hazel doesn't have a specific time period, just a vague historical vibe, so these boots work just fine for her. Since this was a drawing of trying new things, I also experimented with the way I shaded Hazel's skin. I emphasized the rosiness of her nose and cheeks, as well as her knuckles, then used a slightly bluish shade to add coolness to other sections of her skin. When blended out, I think it looked more natural than my normal method of skin shading, where everything is shaded in just a dark shade of the same skin. Skin isn't actually all one color, and emphasizing the undertones can make it look more like skin. One part of the skin I kept working on was rendering around the eyes. In the original image, the witch has red-rimmed eyes, because I used to picture witches as crying blood, so of course their eyes would be reddish. I decided to keep the same look, but for a different reason. Hazel doesn't cry blood, but she definitely is an overworker who isn't getting enough sleep, leaving her eyes rimmed in red. Seeing as it is one of her only features in the extremely simplified original image, it seemed wrong to just remove it. While experimenting with the rendering of the skin went quite smoothly, the hair was a completely different story. I do not understand how to draw curly hair. Usually in my style, I use black outlines to simply draw out some of the curls and leave it at that, but I wanted to render it out more in this drawing. My first attempt at rendering the hair was to try and define each coil with highlights and shadows, but I made all those coils too uniform and straight, and it just didn't work with the wild and windswept outline of the shape of Hazel's hair. I tried to make them look less uniform by warping the layer so the coils were also wavy. That looked even more wrong. At this point, I gave up and started over. My second attempt was more familiar territory. I drew several layers of curls with my line art brush, then locked those layers and shaded those lines. This is the same method I used to draw the manes and tails of the unicorns in the drawing linked in the corner here, if you want a more in-depth explanation of this method. This method doesn't work as well for curly hair, it's more wavy, but I spent so long on a rendering method that didn't work, and I didn't want to experiment with another method that might fail. Eventually I'll learn how to draw curly hair in a way that works for me, but it will not be today. When I finished colouring Hazel in, I moved on to her familiar, a black cat with a silver moon pendant around her neck. I love black cats, especially ones with green eyes like hers. In the original image, the cat is perched on the broomstick in a very unstable and uncat-like way. In this updated version, I made the cat lying down on the broomstick with her head up to look around. I worked hard to make her look very soft and fluffy, especially the floof on her belly and her tail. Finally, I coloured the broomstick, which I haven't really mentioned until now. It's a very simple design, a slightly warped handle with a bundle of sticks at the back. The one interesting detail of the broom are the 2 green crystals tied around the base, because crystals are witchy and look cool and the broom needed more detail. As if I hadn't experimented enough with this drawing, I also decided to play with the colour of the line art. Earlier in the image I set myself a colour palette, and to make it more uniform, I green tinted every colour except those used for the skin. This means all my blacks are slightly green. Late in the colouring process, I decided to see if making the normally black outlines dark green would help with the unification of this image. It actually looked pretty good, except with the skin. I then coloured the lines around the face and hand with a dark shade of Hazel's skin. At this point, I was no longer sure if I liked the coloured lines better than the original black, so I posted both options on my Instagram and asked which one people liked better. Instagram decided that the black outlines worked better, so I went back to my original outlines, and I'm happy with this choice. With that, the witch was done, except for the shading, which comes later. I then moved on to the background. The background in the original image has 3 parts: the pine trees, the bats, and the full moon in a starry night sky. I kept all 3 elements. However, while the elements are fine, the colours I used in the original image are not. I had not yet learned that desaturation is actually quite a good thing sometimes. The bright dark blue and green of the sky and trees dominate the image, where the witch is supposed to be the main focus. I decided to put no green in the background, keeping all the green for the witch in the foreground. Instead, the pine trees are black and very dark blue against the blue night sky. Pine trees are shockingly easy to make look good, at least in silhouette form, in a background where they don't need a lot of detail. I used one textured brush for the whole forest. My method was very simple. I started by drawing the trunk of the pine tree, keeping the different trees at different heights. I then drew out a few lines for branches, more sparse toward the top and thicker the further down the trunk they grow. I then added pine needles to each of those branches, just drawing a lot of quick lines on each branch. Wherever there was too much empty space, I would add more of these quick messy lines until the tree felt lush enough. Then I moved on to the next tree. By making several different layers of these pine trees, I was able to recolor some in a lighter shade to make them fade more into the background. 3 layers of trees was enough to make a thick forest, and this was one of the quickest backgrounds I've drawn that also looks good and detailed. Bats have been a bit of a problem for me in the past. They seem so simple to draw, but I would never get the shape right, specifically the shape of their wings. In this drawing, however, I finally figured out the problem I was having using some reference images. I always used to draw bats with the top of their wings completely flat, but they have a joint in the top of the wing. That's their elbow. The final element of the background was the moon and stars, both easy to draw. The moon is just a white circle that I made glow. I repositioned the moon from the original image. It's right behind Hazel's head, framing her hat and hair, and bringing focus to her face, since eyes are drawn to contrast. The moon is contrast because it is such a bright white against an image that is almost entirely dark. Because the moon is behind Hazel from the perspective of the viewer, Hazel is backlit. Backlighting is really fun and dramatic to shade. The shadows on Hazel are blue. My favorite part of the shading is shading between the folds of the skirt. Fabric folds are always a fun element to render. The shadows in this image are dark, since of course it's nighttime, and dark shadows almost always make things look a bit more dramatic. I made things even more dramatic, as well as providing contrast between dark robes and dark background, by adding a rim of moonlight around the figures and the broomstick. The moonlight is also blue, a light silvery blue against the dark blue shadows. I finished this image with some final shadows around the bottom corners of the image, to make sure the focus is on the center where the moon and the faces of Hazel and her cat are. In the end, despite how technically poor the original image is, I didn't really change much. Of course, I redrew everything with 7 more years of skill and practice, but the actual composition is almost the same, and all the elements of the original are still present. I muted the colors, I moved the moon to provide a better focus point and contrast, I added detail to the robes, and I repositioned the cat, but the pose and most of Hazel's design are the same. I often cringe at my old art, but really it isn't too bad. I just had a lot more learning to do, but the elements were there. I hope you enjoyed this transformation. I have a lot of fun revisiting my old art and recreating it, and I highly recommend it. Don't get rid of your old art. I think it's really nice to keep a record of how far you've come, but it is fun to update it. If you enjoyed watching today's video, please consider liking it, subscribing if you haven't already, and watching some more of my art videos. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye!